One ancient clay tablet survived flood, fire, and empire, and on it, a scribe recorded lunar movements so exact that modern astronomers can still test them against the sky. But buried beside those calculations are references to divine authorities, celestial houses, and a moon treated as if it belonged to a hidden order the Sumerians believed watched over time itself. So why did the oldest scientific records on Earth preserve mystery and mathematics together? If you know how to read the signs is a continuous record of the moon stretching back further than almost any other surviving document in human history. If you are watching this for the first time, consider subscribing now, because this channel exists precisely for stories like this one. Quiet, factual, and stranger than almost anything invented. The earliest writing from southern Mesopotamia did not begin as astronomy. It began as grain counts. Around 3300 BC, scribes in the city of Uruk pressed reed styluses into wet clay to record temple deliveries, livestock inventories, and labour assignments. These tablets were administrative tools, the bureaucratic memory of a civilization that could not afford to forget. But embedded inside that same administrative system was something else entirely: the moon. Because every record in a temple economy required a date. Every date required a month. Every month required someone to watch the sky and confirm when the crescent reappeared. That observation was not casual. It was systematic, repeated, and accumulative. Generation after generation of temple officials watching the same horizon, pressing the same symbols into clay, building a record that would eventually span more than 1500 years of continuous lunar observation. The Mulapin tablets, dating to approximately 1000 BC, but drawing on observational traditions reaching back to the 3rd millennium BC, preserve the first organized map of that record. The first tablet divides the night sky into 3 distinct paths: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, and the way of Ea, each containing specific constellations and their associated rising times. The lunar calculations embedded within these texts track not only the basic 29.5-day lunar month, but also the far more complex Saros cycle, 223 lunations spanning 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. That cycle allows for the precise prediction of eclipses, as modern archaeoastronomers have verified these calculations using computer modelling of ancient eclipse records. The numbers match, which immediately raises a question that no single tablet fully answers. Calculations at this level of precision do not emerge from casual sky watching. They require consistent observation across centuries, elevated vantage points, stable recording systems, and institutional memory that outlasted individual lifetimes. The precision required to track the moon's apogee and perigee variations, faithfully recorded in the astronomical diaries of Babylon, demands something that looks less like ancient ritual and more like a long-running scientific program. The deity at the center of that program was Nana, known in Akkadian as Sin. His name derives from the Sumerian word for the crescent moon. But Nana was not simply a moon god in the way later mythologies would understand the term. His iconography depicts an elderly figure crowned with the crescent, carrying a staff that measures the passage of time, not a warrior, not a king, but a regulator, a timekeeper, a system. Nana's position within the Anunnaki hierarchy reflects exactly that function. As son of Enlil, the god of air and authority, and father of both Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, the goddess of Venus, Nana occupied the central position in the celestial family tree, the fixed point around which the rest of the sky was organized. But his role extended far beyond divine genealogy. Administrative texts from Ur and Babylon described Nana as the keeper of the Tablet of Destinies, the document that recorded the decisions of the Anunnaki Assembly. Lunar phases under his authority regulated agricultural calendars, legal proceedings, temple festivals, and debt cycles. Mesopotamian courts did not convene arbitrarily. They convened when the moon permitted it. That meant Nana was not metaphorically in charge of time. He was literally the mechanism through which time was administered. Hymns and incantations from across the Mesopotamian period contain repeated references to Nana's house in heaven, described using the Sumerian term Egal, meaning great house. These texts describe the god travelling between his earthly temples and his celestial dwelling, following the lunar orbital path that takes him beyond terrestrial observation for 3 days each month during the new moon phase. Whether interpreted as theology, astronomy, or something in between, these texts were recorded by scribes who treated them as factual descriptions of a real structure. The architectural record then introduces its most dramatic witness. The ziggurat of Ur, built under Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, rises 64 feet above the surrounding plain. Its corners are precisely oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of less than 1 degree of error. The structure's 3 levels correspond to the 3 primary phases of lunar visibility: waxing, full, and waning. And each level contains chambers with openings that frame specific portions of the night sky. The uppermost platform, originally crowned with a shrine to Nana, provides an unobstructed view of the entire lunar orbital path from moonrise to moonset. Recent excavations at Ur have uncovered underground chambers connected to the ziggurat's foundation. These chambers contain stone platforms carved with precise angular measurements and channels that appear designed to track shadow movements cast by moonlight. Features consistent with systems for measuring lunar parallax, the slight apparent shift in the moon's position when viewed from different locations on Earth's surface. Similar alignments appear at other Sumerian sites, with variations that suggest different specialized functions across a coordinated observational network. The ziggurat at Babylon, dedicated to Marduk but containing shrines to Nana, demonstrates alignments with specific lunar standstill positions that occur only once every 18.6 years, extreme northern and southern positions of moonrise and moonset that require decades of patient observation to detect at all. The mathematical content of the cuneiform texts makes the full picture even harder to set aside. Tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal contain calculations that track the moon's changing orbital speed throughout its elliptical path, accounting for the fact that the moon moves faster when closer to Earth and slower when farther away. This understanding of what later European science would call Kepler's second law of planetary motion predates its rediscovery in the West by more than 2,000 years. And here is where the Anunnaki enter the record not as mythology, but as administrative language. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the establishment of celestial stations for the Anunnaki gods. 50 were assigned to heaven, 50 to earth, and 50 to the underworld, a cosmic administrative system spanning multiple realms. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's journey to a place where beings dwell in the heavens and descend to earth only for specific purposes. The Sumerian king list refers to rulers who descended from heaven and later returned to it, using terminology that suggests directed movement between terrestrial and celestial locations. The Akkadian term Shamu, typically translated as heaven, carries connotations of physical height and elevation, and when combined with the determinative sign for house or dwelling, it points toward constructed habitations existing in the space above Earth's surface. Excavations at Mari have uncovered bronze mirrors with parabolic curves capable of focusing moonlight for precision observation. Similar finds from Babylon include crystal lenses ground to optical specifications that would enhance visibility of celestial details invisible to the naked eye. None of this arrived fully formed, it accumulated. Layer by layer, tablet by tablet, dynasty by dynasty. From the first grain lists of Uruk to the eclipse archives of Nineveh, a single observation was refined across more than 1,500 years into something that looks, under honest examination, like a long-running scientific institution. The question this record leaves open is not whether the Sumerians watched the moon. The question is what they believed they were watching it for. To understand that, we have to go back further than any temple. we have to go back to the moment before the moon became sacred, when it was still just a problem of time, and time was still just a problem of survival. The oldest surviving records of the moon were not written by priests, they were written by accountants. That detail is easy to pass over. But it changes something fundamental about how we understand what came next, because it means that before the moon became sacred, before it became the dwelling of gods and the keeper of cosmic order, it was solving a much more immediate problem. It was keeping track of debt. Southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BC was not a landscape built for comfort. The floodplains between the Tigris and the Euphrates were flat, they lay exposed, and governed almost entirely by water. There were no mountains to orient by, no forests to shelter under. The horizon in every direction was the same unbroken line: reed marshes, river channels, and open sky. That geography did something unusual to the people who settled it. It made them look up. In a landscape without landmarks, the sky became the primary reference system. The position of stars indicated seasons. The behaviour of rivers could be anticipated by watching certain constellations rise and set. And the moon, more than anything else, provided the one thing that an agricultural economy absolutely could not function without: a reliable count of days. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk, pressed into clay around 3300 BC, reveal exactly how that count was being used, and grain deliveries were dated. Labour allocations were recorded by month. Temple distributions of oil, textiles, and livestock were organised around lunar cycles that determined when obligations fell due and when accounts had to be settled. The month, in this system, did not begin arbitrarily. It began when a temple official, or more likely a designated observer, confirmed the first visible crescent of the new moon on the western horizon after sunset. That moment of visibility was not ceremonial. It was administrative. The crescent's appearance triggered a cascade of institutional actions. Markets opened, legal hearings were scheduled, canal irrigation rotations were adjusted, and tax cycles advanced by 1 unit. Miss the crescent and the entire system of dates fell out of alignment, which means that somewhere in Uruk, in the centuries before writing had developed enough to record myth or prayer, someone was already stationed at a specific location, watching a specific point on the horizon every clear evening near the end of each lunar month. Not for theology, for accounting. The floodplain itself made that observation both essential and difficult. Southern Mesopotamia's agricultural calendar depended on predicting when the rivers would rise and when they would recede. Plant too early, and the flood would erase the crop. Plant too late, and the growing season would not close before the next inundation. The margin of error was narrow, and the consequences of miscalculation were immediate. Lunar cycles provided the framework, but the moon alone was not enough. As temple administrators needed to know how the lunar calendar aligned with seasonal flooding, which required tracking the moon's relationship to specific stars across months and years. The earliest lexical tablets from Uruk include groupings of star names alongside agricultural terms, suggesting that sky observation and farming calendars were being coordinated from the very beginning of the written record. This was not a civilization that stumbled into astronomy. It was a civilization that required astronomy to feed itself. Here is the detail that tends to stop historians mid-sentence. The administrative tablets from Uruk do not show a society learning to observe the sky. They show a society that had already been observing it long enough to have developed standardized recording systems for what it found. The writing is the end of a process, not the beginning, which raises a question the tablets themselves cannot answer. How long before the first clay was pressed had Mesopotamian communities already been maintaining consistent lunar records in memory, in oral tradition, or in materials that did not survive? The written record begins at 3300 BC. What it describes is a system already mature. By the time the first myths began to appear alongside the administrative texts, hymns, divine lists, early cosmological fragments, the moon's practical authority was already centuries old. The transition from lunar accounting to lunar theology was not a sudden invention. It was a gradual elevation of something that had already proven itself indispensable. A calendar that regulated debt, harvest, and water rights did not need to become sacred. It already was, in every functional sense, the organizing principle of civilization. What changed was the language used to describe it. The crescent that had once marked the beginning of a tax cycle became the crown of Nana. The 3-day disappearance of the moon that had once complicated month counting became the god's withdrawal to his celestial dwelling. The precision required to track the moon's behaviour across years and decades became evidence of divine intelligence operating through the sky. The observation did not change. The interpretation of what was being observed did. That shift matters more than it might appear, because once lunar observation became lunar theology, it was no longer simply a technical skill that any competent official could perform. It became a domain of specialised knowledge, controlled by temple institutions, embedded in priestly training, and protected by the same bureaucratic structures that had originally produced it. Knowledge that had once been administrative became sacred, and sacred knowledge in Mesopotamia was also political power. The temple that controlled the lunar calendar controlled the timing of everything: planting, harvesting, legal proceedings, debt forgiveness, and the festivals that legitimized kingship itself. The moon had not changed, but its authority over human life had become total, and yet the earliest tablets offer no moment of transformation, no founding decree, no text that says, "Beginning now, the moon is divine." There is only a continuous record stretching back as far as the writing goes, in which the moon is already both practical and sacred at once, as if the two had never been separate categories to begin with, which leaves the question sitting quietly at the edge of the record. If the moon's authority was already fully formed by the time writing began, if the administrative system and the theological system were already operating together from the very first tablets, then when did practical observation become divine authority? And why was it the moon, specifically, that stood at the centre of that transformation? The answer is not in the administrative tablets. It is in what the temples built to face it. In ancient Mesopotamia, a court case could not begin until the moon allowed it. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented legal condition, recorded in administrative tablets from Ur and Babylon. Embedded in the institutional structure of cities that had been functioning for centuries before the texts that preserved them were even pressed. The moon did not merely illuminate the night sky over Mesopotamia. It governed the calendar by which human disputes were resolved, debts were collected, and political authority was renewed. And at the centre of that system stood a single figure whose name appears more frequently in surviving Sumerian hymns than almost any other deity in the entire pantheon. Nana's earliest appearances in the written record are not dramatic. He does not arrive in the text with thunder or conquest. He appears in administrative documents, in month names, in festival schedules, in the headings of legal tablets that specify the lunar date on which a transaction was witnessed and sealed. His presence in those documents is quiet, procedural, and total. The Sumerian lunar calendar organized its months around Nana's observable phases. Each month began with a confirmed sighting of the new crescent. Each month ended with the moon's 3-day disappearance before that crescent returned. The names assigned to individual months varied by city and period, but the underlying structure was consistent across Mesopotamia. The moon's visibility determined when institutional time advanced. This was not a religious preference layered over a separate civic calendar. It was the calendar. There was no other one. The city of Ur held a particular relationship to Nana that distinguished it from other Mesopotamian centres. Ur was his city. His primary temple complex, known as the Ekishnugal, stood at the heart of the urban fabric, not at the edge of the settlement, not in a ceremonial district, but physically integrated into the administrative core of one of the ancient world's most densely organised cities. Temple hymns from the Ur III period, approximately 2100 to 2000 BC, described the Ekishnugal in language that blends architectural precision with cosmic function. The temple is described as a structure whose foundations reach into the underworld and whose summit touches the sky, not as poetic exaggeration, but as a statement of institutional scope. The building connected the lunar calendar above to the legal and economic machinery below. The high priestess of Nana at Ur held one of the most politically significant positions in the entire Mesopotamian world. During the Ur III period, this role was occupied by daughters of reigning kings, a deliberate act of political consolidation that merged royal legitimacy with lunar religious authority. The king's daughter controlled Nana's calendar. Nana's calendar controlled the timing of everything the king's government administered. That arrangement was not accidental. Here is what the administrative tablets make explicit that the hymns only imply. Debt repayment schedules in Mesopotamian legal documents were organized around specific lunar months. Contracts specify not only the year of a transaction, but the lunar month and the phase within that month when payment fell due. Legal proceedings, property disputes, inheritance claims, commercial disagreements were scheduled around festival calendars that Nana's priesthood maintained and published. A creditor could not collect outside the permitted lunar window. A court could not hear testimony on days the calendar designated as ritually closed. This means that the priesthood of Nana, by controlling the published lunar calendar, controlled the precise timing of every legal and financial obligation in cities that use their system. That is not religious influence over civic life. That is civic life organized entirely inside a religious framework. The midpoint of that framework, the detail that tends to reframe everything around it, is this. The Sumerian month names were not uniform across all cities and all periods. Different cities maintained their own local lunar month names, their own festival schedules, their own adjustments for the gap between the lunar year of 354 days and the solar agricultural year of approximately 365. That gap, 11 days annually, compounds over years into a serious calendrical drift. Left uncorrected, a lunar calendar detaches from the agricultural seasons it was designed to regulate, and the entire system of planting cycles, harvest timing, and flood prediction breaks down. Mesopotamian administrators corrected this by periodically intercalating an extra month, inserting a 13th lunar month into certain years to realign the calendar with the seasons. The decision of when to intercalate did not belong to the king. It belonged to the temple. Which means that the priesthood of Nana held the authority not merely to count months, but to create them, to insert time itself into the civic calendar when the system required adjustment. No harvest could be officially timed, no debt could fall legally due, no court date could be set without first knowing whether the current year contained 12 months or 13, and only the temple knew. The hymns addressed to Nana reflect this authority in language that is easy to read as poetry, but functions as institutional description. One surviving hymn from the Ur III period addresses Nana as the one who holds the measuring rope of heaven and earth, the rope being a specific surveying instrument used in Mesopotamian legal practice to establish land boundaries and property divisions. The image is precise. Nana does not merely illuminate the sky, he measures it, is in the same technical sense that a surveyor measures a field before its ownership can be legally recorded. Another hymn describes him as the Lord who determines the month, not observes it, not reflects it, but determines it. The language of agency is deliberate. The moon did not simply happen, it was administered. By the late 3rd millennium BC, that administration had become one of the most stable institutional structures in the ancient world. Temples maintained multi-generational records of lunar observations, festival outcomes, and calendrical adjustments. Scribal schools trained students in the mathematics of month counting, alongside hymns addressed to the deity those calculations served. The religious and the technical were not two subjects, they were one curriculum. A scribe who could not recite Nana's hymns could not be trusted with his calendar. A priest who could not perform the lunar calculations could not fulfill the institutional role the hymns described. That fusion of devotion and precision, of theology and mathematics, produced something that neither tradition alone would have generated, which returns everything to the question the administrative tablets quietly raise. If the priesthood of Nana controlled the calendar, and the calendar controlled the timing of every legal and economic obligation in Mesopotamian civilization, then the accuracy of their lunar measurements was not a matter of religious preference. It was a matter of institutional survival. A miscalculated intercalation would misalign harvests, invalidate legal deadlines, and undermine the political authority of every institution that depended on the calendar's credibility. The priests of Nana did not merely watch the moon because it was sacred. They watched it because they could not afford to be wrong. And that raises the question that no hymn directly answers. If priests controlled time itself, if the entire administrative weight of Mesopotamian civilization rested on the accuracy of their lunar measurements, how precisely were they actually measuring it? The answer is not in the temples, it is in the mathematics they left behind. At some point in the history of Mesopotamian astronomy, observation became calculation. The exact moment that transition occurred is not recorded. What survives instead is the result, a body of mathematical tablets so precise, so internally consistent, and so thoroughly verified by modern astronomy that the question is no longer whether ancient Mesopotamian scholars understood the moon's behaviour with scientific accuracy. The question is how long it took them to get there, and the answer, embedded in the tablets themselves, is deeply uncomfortable. It took centuries, possibly longer, which means the tradition of sustained, institutionally maintained lunar observation, stretching back behind the surviving written record, was not an assumption historians made carelessly. It is what the mathematics requires. The Babylonian continuation of Sumerian astronomical methods did not represent a break from what came before it. It represented an inheritance, a body of accumulated observational data passed forward through scribal institutions across generations, refined by each successive group of scholars who received it, and eventually compressed into mathematical systems precise enough to function as predictive tools rather than merely descriptive ones. The foundation of that system was deceptively simple. The lunar month, the time between one new crescent and the next, is not a fixed number. It varies between approximately 29 days 6 hours and 29 days 20 hours, depending on where the moon sits in its elliptical orbit. The average across many months converges on 29.5 days. That average is easy to state. It is significantly harder to establish with confidence, because confirming it requires observing enough individual months, across enough years, in enough detail, to smooth out the variation and isolate the underlying pattern. Mesopotamian records show that scholars had done exactly that. Early administrative tablets track month lengths as either 29 or 30 days, with notations indicating which months required the additional day to maintain calendar alignment. This is not guesswork. It reflects accumulated observation of actual lunar behaviour, recorded consistently enough to reveal the statistical pattern beneath the visible irregularity. The moon had been measured, but that was only the beginning of what the tablet contained. The Mul-Apin tablets, already mentioned in this account for their star catalogue and sky path divisions, carry within them a second layer of content that receives considerably less attention than their astronomical geography. Embedded in the Mul-Apin texts are procedures for predicting the moon's visibility, specifically for calculating in advance whether the crescent would be visible on a given evening, and if not, when it would next appear. These procedures account for the moon's changing position relative to the horizon across different seasons, the varying length of twilight, and the moon's angular distance from the sun at the moment of potential visibility. This is not observation. This is modelling. The distinction matters enormously. An observer watches the sky and records what appears. A modeller calculates what should appear before looking up. and then checks whether the calculation held. The Moorlapin procedures represent a system already operating in the second mode. Someone, at some point before these tablets were pressed, had observed enough crescent appearances under enough different conditions to extract the underlying variables and encode them into a predictive procedure. That procedure was then taught to students, copied into archives, and applied institutionally across the calendar system for generations. Then there is the Saros cycle, 223 lunar months, 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. The interval after which the geometry of the Earth, Moon, and Sun returns to almost exactly the same configuration, and eclipses repeat in a predictable sequence. Identifying the Saros cycle from observational data alone requires maintaining accurate eclipse records across a minimum of several decades. Confirming it requires records spanning multiple complete cycles, meaning the observation program that produced it must have been running continuously for well over a century before the pattern could be reliably isolated. Mesopotamian eclipse records satisfy that requirement. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon and Nineveh preserve eclipse observations dated across multiple centuries, with notations indicating whether an eclipse was observed directly or predicted in advance. The predicted eclipses, events recorded before they occurred, based on the Saros interval alone, appear in the record as early as the 1st millennium BC. Modern astronomers have checked these predictions against independently calculated eclipse chronologies. The Mesopotamian predictions are correct. Here is the detail that changes the weight of everything described so far. The mathematical procedures used in later Babylonian astronomy, the ones that track the moon's variable orbital speed, calculate its position within the zodiacal belt, and predict eclipse possibilities months in advance, are not simple extensions of the Moorlapin observation methods. They represent a qualitative leap in mathematical sophistication that historians of science did not fully appreciate until the 20th century, when analysis of cuneiform tablets from the British Museum and the Berlin collections revealed something unexpected. Babylonian astronomers of the late 1st millennium BC were using arithmetic procedures that functioned, in practical terms, as early forms of what modern mathematics would recognize as piecewise linear functions, systematic methods for modeling a continuously changing quantity using a series of calculated steps. These procedures allowed scholars to compute the moon's position, speed, and visibility without observing it directly, using mathematics alone to generate predictions that could then be verified against the sky. The sophistication of those procedures does not emerge from the surviving tablets without context. It emerges from centuries of prior observations so consistent and so carefully recorded that the underlying mathematical relationships had become visible within the data. The observation produced the pattern produced the mathematics, and the mathematics eventually produced predictions accurate enough that modern software, reconstructing ancient eclipse geometry from first principles, confirms them. That chain, from raw observation to mathematical model to verified prediction, did not form quickly. Scholars examining the Babylonian astronomical diaries, a series of tablets recording nightly sky observations maintained across several centuries, have estimated that the continuous observation program they represent began no later than the 7th century BC. Some lines of evidence suggest the program's origins reach back considerably further, into periods from which fewer tablets survive but whose data appears embedded in later calculations as inherited baseline values. The diaries themselves are methodical to a degree that is almost difficult to absorb. Night after night, month after month, decade after decade, the position of the moon relative to specific reference stars, the timing of its rising and setting, the occurrence or non-occurrence of predicted eclipses, and deviations from calculated positions were all recorded, archived, and preserved. Not for a single scholar's use, for the institution, for whoever came next. The mathematics the tablets contain had to come from somewhere consistent enough, elevated enough, and protected enough from the disruptions of flood, warfare and political collapse to maintain an unbroken observational record across generations. The clay preserved the numbers, but something had to produce the conditions under which those numbers could be gathered. And that raises the question the mathematics alone cannot answer. Where exactly were these observations being made, with enough consistency, enough elevation, and enough institutional continuity to survive not years, not decades, but centuries? The answer is not in the tablets. It is in the structures built to face the sky. The ziggurat of Ur was not built to be beautiful. That is not a dismissal. It is a precision. Every dimension of that structure, its height, its orientation, its internal geometry, the angle of its external staircases, the placement of its summit shrine, was determined by requirements that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with function. The question archaeologists have been quietly debating for decades is exactly which function took precedence. The religious answer is well documented. The astronomical answer is written into the building itself. And the possibility that those two answers describe the same thing, that ritual and observation were never separate categories in the minds of the people who built it, is what makes the Ziggurat of Ur one of the most carefully considered structures in the ancient world. Ur-Nammu, the king who ordered its construction around 2100 BC, was not building a monument to personal glory in the way later rulers would understand that impulse. He was rebuilding an older sacred site on a scale that matched the institutional ambitions of the Ur-3 state, a centralized administration that had unified much of southern Mesopotamia under a single bureaucratic system and needed its religious architecture to reflect that consolidation. The ziggurat that emerged from that project rises in 3 massive terraced levels from a base measuring approximately 64 meters by 45 meters. Its corners are oriented to the cardinal directions with a documented angular accuracy of less than 1 degree of error. That precision is not incidental. On the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where there are no natural landmarks to align against, achieving cardinal orientation to that degree of accuracy requires either systematic astronomical observation or a surveying tradition sophisticated enough to extract cardinal directions from stellar or solar behavior. The building is its own evidence that one of those conditions was met. The elevation the structure provides is equally deliberate. Southern Mesopotamia sits at near sea level. The surrounding landscape offers no natural high ground. In that environment, every additional meter of elevation dramatically extends the visible horizon, and for lunar observation specifically, horizon visibility matters. The crescent moon's first appearance after the new moon phase occurs close to the western horizon, in a narrow window of twilight that lasts only minutes. Atmospheric haze, ground-level dust, and the curvature of the Earth all work against an observer standing at ground level. Elevation reduces those obstacles. Even modest height above the surrounding plain can extend the window of crescent visibility by measurable minutes and allow observation of a thinner crescent than would be detectable from the ground. The summit of the Ziggurat of Ur, rising approximately 21 meters above the plain in its current eroded state and considerably higher in its original form, provided exactly that advantage. It placed an observer above the worst of the atmospheric interference, above the reed marshes and irrigation channels that generated ground-level haze, and above the built environment of the city itself, with an unobstructed view of the horizon in every direction. This does not prove the ziggurat was designed as an observatory. It establishes that it would have functioned as one regardless of whether that was the primary intention. The internal organization of the structure adds another layer to that reading. The 3 terraced levels of the Ziggurat of Ur correspond in their visible sequencing to the 3 primary phases of lunar visibility: waxing, full, and waning. Whether this correspondence was architecturally deliberate or emerged from the same institutional culture that organized everything around lunar cycles is a distinction that may not have been meaningful to the builders. In a civilization where lunar phases structured legal calendars, agricultural schedules, and religious festivals simultaneously, building a three-tiered temple to the moon god in a form that reflected those three phases would not have required a special decision. It would have been the obvious choice. The summit shrine, accessible only to the highest-ranking temple personnel, sat at the apex of that progression, the point closest to the sky, reserved for those whose institutional role placed them in direct mediation between the lunar deity above and the administrative machinery below. Access to the summit was access to the observation point, and access to the observation point was access to the calendar. Here is where the architectural record introduces something that does not appear in the standard descriptions of the ziggurat's function. Recent archaeological analysis of Mesopotamian ziggurat construction more broadly has identified a consistent feature across multiple sites. The external staircases of these structures are not positioned symmetrically for aesthetic balance. They are positioned to allow approach from specific directions at specific times of year, creating shadow lines and alignment markers that correspond to astronomically significant dates. At Ur, the main ceremonial staircase faces northeast, a direction that, at the latitude of ancient Ur, corresponds to the rising point of the moon at its maximum northern standstill. That standstill occurs once every 18.6 years. It is not visible without sustained multi-decade observation of moonrise positions across the full range of the lunar cycle. The staircase faces it anyway. The broader pattern across Sumerian sites is consistent enough to resist dismissal as coincidence. Different ziggurats demonstrate alignments with different astronomically significant positions. Solstice sunrise, lunar standstill extremes, the rising points of specific bright stars used as seasonal markers. The variation suggests not a single standardized design, but a distributed network of structures each tuned to different observational priorities, collectively covering a range of celestial phenomena that no single site could monitor alone. That network, if it functioned as the architectural evidence implies, would have provided Mesopotamian astronomers with something modern science understands as essential to long-period astronomical research. Multiple simultaneous observation points, each contributing data that the others could not generate. The mathematics found in the cuneiform tablets did not need to come from a single location. It could have been assembled from many, and yet the ziggurats remain officially temples, not observatories, not research stations. Temples, religious structures whose primary purpose was ritual, whose summit shrines house divine presences, and whose institutional authority derived from their sacred rather than their scientific function. That classification is accurate. It is also, in the context of Mesopotamian civilization, incomplete. Because in a world where the lunar calendar was simultaneously religious, legal, agricultural, and mathematical, where the priest and the astronomer and the administrator were trained in the same scribal school, reading the same tablets, serving the same institutional hierarchy, the distinction between a temple and an observatory was not a distinction that Mesopotamian civilization had any reason to make. The building faced the sky. The sky governed the calendar. The calendar governed everything, which leaves a question that the architecture raises but cannot answer on its own. If temples gave the sky structure, if the ziggurat's orientation, elevation, and an internal geometry all served to bring the moon's behaviour within the reach of institutional observation, why did later Sumerian and Babylonian texts place the moon not simply above the city, but inside a vast cosmic government? Why was Nana not merely a timekeeper? Why was he a judge? The answer requires leaving the architecture behind and entering the texts that the temples produced. The word Anunnaki appears in Sumerian texts before anyone had decided what it meant. That is not a loose claim. It is a philological observation that scholars of cuneiform literature have noted carefully. The term occurs across a wide range of textual contexts, applied to different groups of divine beings in different periods, with a consistency of tone that does not match a consistency of definition. Yet modern popular culture has settled on a single interpretation of the Anunnaki that the original sources do not support. but the sources themselves, read without that overlay, describe something considerably more interesting and considerably more unsettling in its implications than the interpretation that replaced them. The term Anunnaki derives from Sumerian components most commonly interpreted as meaning something in the range of those of princely seed or the princely offspring of An, and being the sky god, the uppermost deity in the Sumerian divine hierarchy. In the earliest surviving texts, the Anunnaki appear as a collective, a divine assembly rather than a specific group of named individuals. They are the great gods, the senior divine council, the cosmic authority from which legitimate decisions descend. Their function in those early texts is judicial and administrative. They do not build things. They do not travel between planets. They deliberate, decree, and record. The image is not of supernatural visitors arriving from elsewhere. It is of a cosmic bureaucracy, a divine government whose decisions carry the weight of universal law and whose records, once made, cannot be unmade. The judicial dimension of the Anunnaki is one of the least discussed aspects of their role in Sumerian literature and one of the most revealing. In texts dealing with the underworld, including the descent of Inanna and various Sumerian death literature, the Anunnaki appear specifically as judges. They sit in assembly in the realm of the dead and determine the fate of those who arrive before them. Their verdict is not emotional or arbitrary, it is procedural. It follows from an assessment of the deceased's life against a standard that the divine assembly maintains. That judicial function mirrors with deliberate precision the structure of Mesopotamian earthly courts. Earthly judges sat in assembly. Earthly verdicts were recorded on clay. Earthly decisions derived their legitimacy from their conformity to established law, itself understood as descending from divine authority. The Anunnaki did not model themselves on human courts. Human courts modeled themselves on the Anunnaki. Divine lists, systematic catalogues of deities compiled by Mesopotamian scribes across multiple periods, place the Anunnaki within a hierarchical structure that reflects the same organizational logic as the administrative state. An, the sky god, sits at the apex. Enlil, god of air and authority, functions as executive power, the deity through whom divine decisions are implemented on earth. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, serves as the intellectual and technical authority, the keeper of the me, the divine laws and civilizational attributes that make ordered society possible. Beneath these senior figures, the Anunnaki assemble as the deliberative body, the council whose consensus legitimizes major cosmic decisions. That structure, executive, advisory, deliberative, is not mythology dressed in divine costume. It is a description of how Mesopotamian political authority understood itself to be organized. Royal inscriptions from the earthly period and later Babylonian dynasties consistently frame kingship as a mandate descending from the divine assembly. A king didn't rule because he was powerful. Yeah, he ruled because the Anunnaki had determined that he should, a determination recorded in the logic of the texts, on tablets of destiny that the divine council maintained. Legitimacy in Mesopotamia was always a matter of record. Here is the detail that reframes the entire picture. The me, the divine laws attributed to Enki's keeping, are not abstract principles in the texts that describe them. They are enumerated, listed, catalogued. Surviving Sumerian literature includes what scholars call the me list, a specific inventory of the attributes of civilization that the gods possess and that humanity receive from them. The list includes kingship, priestly office, the scribal arts, music, the descent into the underworld, the ascent from it, and dozens of other specific institutional and cultural functions. Each one is a named, discrete item. Each one is something that can be held, transferred, stolen, or restored. In one of the most analysed Sumerian narratives, Inanna travels to Enki's dwelling and acquires the Ami, taking them from the keeper of divine law and bringing them to her city of Uruk. The text treats this transfer as a literal transaction, not a metaphor. The me are objects. They have weight in the logic of the story. They can be carried on a boat. What this reveals about Sumerian thought is significant and largely absent from popular discussions of the Anunnaki. The gods, in authentic Sumerian theology, were not mysterious or ineffable. They were administrators. They held specific offices. They maintained specific records. They operated within a defined hierarchy whose decisions were legitimate precisely because they were documented, because the divine assembly had deliberated, reached consensus, and recorded its verdict on the tablets of destiny that Nana himself was charged with maintaining. The Anunnaki of genuine Sumerian literature are, at their core, a model of how order works. They demonstrate that authority requires documentation, that decisions require assembly, that fate, cosmic, civic, or personal, is not arbitrary but recorded, and therefore in principle knowable. That framework shaped every institution in Mesopotamian civilization. The scribal school taught children to write because the gods governed through writing. The temple maintained archives because the divine assembly maintained archives. The king commissioned inscriptions recording his deeds because legitimacy, in a universe governed by the Anunnaki, was always a matter of what had been written down. Not visited, not intervened, written. Which makes the question that the divine lists and royal inscriptions leave open all the more precise. The Anunnaki governed through records. Their authority was inseparable from documentation. The Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic record of fates determined by divine assembly, appears repeatedly across Sumerian and Babylonian literature as the central object of divine power. Whoever held the tablet held authority over what was decreed. Whoever maintained the tablet maintained the order of the universe. And in the texts that tablet was linked, repeatedly, specifically, and without apparent exception, to written records, to clay, and to the scribal traditions that preserved both. The gods did not rule through force. They ruled through what was inscribed, which raises a question the divine lists alone cannot resolve. If the Anunnaki's authority over cosmic order was inseparable from the act of writing, if fate itself was understood as something recorded rather than merely decided, then why did that same writing tradition invest so heavily, across so many centuries, in preserving not just divine decrees but astronomical observations? Why were the tablets of destiny and the tablets of the sky so often found in the same archives? The answer requires understanding what Mesopotamian scribes believed they were actually doing when they wrote down the moon. In Mesopotamian theology, the universe was governed by a document, not a deity in the conventional sense, not a force or a principle or an abstraction. A document, a physical tablet held by specific hands, containing the recorded decisions of the divine assembly that determined the fate of gods, kings, cities, and the cosmic order itself. The Tablet of Destinies appears across Sumerian and Babylonian literature as the central object of divine authority. Whoever held it held power over what was decreed. In one of the most analysed episodes in Mesopotamian mythology, the tablet is stolen, seized by a lesser deity in an act of cosmic usurpation, and the universe begins to malfunction until it is recovered and restored to its rightful keeper. The universe, in that framework, does not run on divine will alone. It runs on what has been written down. That belief did not exist in isolation from Mesopotamian institutions. It reflected them, and over centuries it shaped them in return, producing a civilization in which the act of writing was not merely practical, but sacred, not merely administrative, but cosmologically necessary. The scribal schools of Mesopotamia were not, in their own self-understanding, teaching a technical skill. They were maintaining the order of the universe. That claim sounds like institutional inflation until the curriculum is examined. Scribal training at centres like Nippur, the most important scribal and religious centre in Mesopotamia across multiple dynasties, began with the most basic elements of cuneiform writing and progressed through a standardized sequence of texts that mixed the practical and the sacred without distinguishing between them. While students copied lexical lists, Systematic inventories of signs, words, animals, plants, professions, and objects organized by category. These lists were not exercises in vocabulary. They were the Mesopotamian understanding of how reality was structured, a written map of the world organized by the same classificatory logic that the Divine Assembly used to administer it. To learn the lexical lists was to learn the categories through which the gods understood creation. To copy them correctly was to participate, in a small but real sense, in the maintenance of cosmic order. The physical process of scribal training reinforced that understanding at every level. Student tablets from Nippur, thousands of which survive, show a consistent pedagogical pattern. A teacher would write a model line on one half of a tablet. The student would copy it on the other half, then reproduce it again on the reverse. The same line, pressed again and again into wet clay, until the hand knew the sign without the mind having to instruct it. This repetition was not mechanical in the way that modern education might understand rote learning. It was ritual. The same text, copied by the same method, in the same sequence, across generations of students working in the same institution. This was how Mesopotamian civilization ensured that the written record did not drift, did not corrupt, didn't gradually transform into something unrecognizable as it passed from one mind to the next. The scribal curriculum was a preservation system. And preservation, in a civilization that understood the universe as document governed, was a sacred obligation. Here is what that system produced that no political institution of the ancient world could match. Dynasties ended, cities were conquered, kings were deposed, assassinated, or simply died without capable successors. The political map of Mesopotamia shifted repeatedly across 3 millennia, Sumerian city-states giving way to Akkadian Empire, then to Ur-3 centralization, then to Babylonian and Assyrian dominance, then to Persian conquest. Each transition represented a discontinuity in political authority. None of them represented a discontinuity in the scribal record. Because the scribal schools, particularly Nippur, which maintained its institutional function across extraordinary political changes, continued operating through conquests that erased the governments that had previously patronized them. New rulers arrived, was recognized the scribal institution's value and continued funding it. The curriculum continued. The copying continued. The archive grew. Texts that had been composed under Sumerian-speaking administrations were copied, translated into Akkadian, and preserved in institutions now operating under Akkadian-speaking rulers. Astronomical observations recorded under one dynasty became the baseline data for calculations performed under a dynasty that had conquered and replaced it. The political authority changed. The written record absorbed the change and continued. This is the midpoint detail that reframes the institutional picture entirely. The scribal tradition at Nippur preserved Sumerian literary and astronomical texts for centuries after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. By the 2nd millennium BC, Sumerian was no longer anyone's native tongue. It had been replaced in everyday speech by Akkadian across most of Mesopotamia, and yet Sumerian continued to be read, written, copied, and taught in scribal schools, maintained as a sacred and scholarly language long after its disappearance from ordinary life. The astronomical and religious texts composed in Sumerian were not translated and discarded. They were preserved in their original language, with Akkadian translations provided alongside them, in a bilingual tradition that treated the original Sumerian as authoritative in a way that the translation could approximate but not replace. This means that lunar observations, calendrical procedures, and astronomical calculations first encoded in Sumerian were still being read, copied, and built upon by scholars working 1,000 years after the language that contained them had died. The knowledge did not die with the language. The clay held it. The archival logic that made this possible was not accidental. Mesopotamian temple and palace archives were maintained with a documentary discipline that modern archivists would recognize. Tablets were organized by category, stored in labeled containers, and inventoried. damaged tablets were copied onto fresh clay before the original deteriorated beyond readability. Older texts were cross-referenced in later compilations that served as finding aids for scholars navigating large collections. The library of a major Mesopotamian temple was not a passive accumulation of documents. It was an actively maintained knowledge system, curated, organized, and continuously supplemented by institutions that understood preservation as part of their core function. That function was theological before it was scholarly. The gods governed through written records. To allow those records to deteriorate was to allow divine order to weaken. To copy and preserve them was to actively maintain the cosmic framework within which human civilization operated. Clay was not merely the material of record-keeping. It was the medium through which the divine order of the universe remained legible to human institutions, which means that when Mesopotamian scribes copied astronomical observations alongside hymns, legal formulas alongside star catalogues, and calendrical calculations alongside mythological narratives, they were not mixing categories carelessly. They were reflecting a worldview in which those categories had never been separate. The moon's behaviour, recorded on clay, was as much a part of the divine record as the tablet of destinies itself. To observe the moon accurately and record that observation correctly was to contribute to the same cosmic archive that the Anunnaki maintained above. The scribe and the astronomer were performing the same act. They were keeping the universe legible. And that raises the question that the archive's own survival makes unavoidable. If writing preserved divine order on Earth, if the scribal tradition was strong enough to carry Sumerian lunar knowledge across the death of its own language and through the political upheavals of 3 millennia, what happened to that knowledge when it passed into the hands of the empires that inherited Mesopotamia? Did it survive intact? Did it grow? And if it did, who was reading it, and what were they doing with what they found? When Babylon rose to dominance in the early 2nd millennium BC, it inherited a lunar calendar it had not invented, astronomical procedures it had not developed, and a scribal tradition it had not created. It copied all of them. That act of institutional copying is easy to frame as cultural borrowing, one civilization absorbing the achievements of another as a natural consequence of conquest and succession. But the scale, the deliberateness, and the precision with which Babylonian and later Assyrian scholars reproduced, organized, and expanded Sumerian astronomical knowledge suggests something more purposeful than absorption. It suggests that the empires which succeeded Sumerian civilization understood, with considerable clarity, that the lunar knowledge they were inheriting was not a cultural artifact. It was a working system, and working systems in the ancient world were worth more than territory. Babylon's relationship to Sumerian intellectual tradition was established early and maintained consistently across the city's long history as a regional power. Babylonian scribal schools continued the curriculum that Nippur had developed: lexical lists, literary texts, astronomical procedures, adapting them into Akkadian while preserving the Sumerian originals as authoritative reference points. The bilingual tablet tradition, already established by the time Babylon consolidated its influence, meant that Babylonian scholars were reading Sumerian astronomical texts in their original language, not in translation. That matters because astronomical procedures are sensitive to linguistic precision. A calculation embedded in a Sumerian text carries specific numerical relationships, specific terminology for lunar phases and stellar positions, and specific procedural steps whose meaning could shift subtly under translation. Babylonian scholars who maintained Sumerian literacy were not merely honouring tradition. They were protecting the integrity of the data. The astronomical diaries of Babylon represent the most sustained observational record in the ancient world. These tablets, a continuous series of nightly sky observations maintained across several centuries of Babylonian institutional history, record the positions of the moon and planets relative to reference stars, the timing of lunar and planetary phenomena, weather conditions, river levels and commodity prices, all organised by date within each lunar month. The combination of astronomical and economic data in the same record is not arbitrary. It reflects the Babylonian understanding that celestial and terrestrial conditions were systematically related, that patterns in the sky corresponded to patterns in the world below, and that an archive comprehensive enough to document both could, over time, reveal those correspondences with enough precision to support prediction. The diaries were not a devotional exercise. They were a long-term research program, and the observational baseline they drew upon, the accumulated lunar data that gave Babylonian astronomers the reference points against which new observations could be calibrated, reached back through institutional memory into Sumerian records that predated Babylon's own political existence. The new empire was building on the old foundation, but the foundation was older than the empire knew how to measure. Assyria's contribution to the preservation of Sumerian sky knowledge arrived later, and in a form that makes its scale impossible to overlook. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who ruled from Nineveh in the 7th century BC, undertook one of the most deliberate acts of intellectual consolidation in the ancient world. He commissioned the systematic collection of tablets from temple libraries, at scribal schools and private scholarly collections across Mesopotamia, dispatching agents to cities throughout the region with instructions to identify, copy and transport significant texts to his palace library at Nineveh. The letters Ashurbanipal sent to his agents survive. They are specific. They request tablets dealing with divination, medicine, ritual and astronomy by category. They instruct collectors to locate texts that are rare, damaged or held in private hands. They specify that copies should be made when originals cannot be acquired, and that the copies should be accurate, a scribble standard rather than a summary. The resulting library at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of tablets when it was excavated by 19th century archaeologists. Among them were astronomical texts stretching back centuries, copies of Sumerian and early Babylonian lunar procedures, eclipse records, and star catalogues that Ashurbanipal's agents had retrieved from institutions across the region and consolidated in a single imperial archive. Here is the detail that the library's contents make unavoidable. Ashurbanipal was not a scholar. He was a military king, one of the most effective and ruthless administrators the ancient world produced, responsible for campaigns that extended Assyrian control across an enormous territory. And yet his library contains texts of a specificity and technical complexity that serve no obvious purpose of political propaganda or administrative function. Eclipse prediction procedures, lunar period calculations, mathematical tables for computing the moon's position across its elliptical orbit, copies of observational diaries spanning decades of nightly sky records. These are not texts a king collects to demonstrate cultural prestige. They are texts a king collects because the institution that produced them told him they were operationally necessary, because the scholars who maintain the astronomical tradition convinced Assyrian imperial authority that the lunar knowledge embedded in those tablets was too valuable to leave distributed across dozens of vulnerable local archives. Ashurbanipal's library was not a monument to learning. It was a backup. The consequences of that decision extended far beyond Ashurbanipal's own reign. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces in 612 BC, when the city was sacked, burned, and largely destroyed in one of the ancient world's most complete urban destructions, the library did not survive intact, but it survived partially. The clay tablets that Ashurbanipal's agents had collected from across Mesopotamia, fired accidentally by the conflagration that destroyed the palace above them, were preserved by the very catastrophe that was meant to erase them. Fire, which destroys papyrus and parchment completely, hardens clay. The destruction of Nineveh baked the archive, and 25 centuries later, 19th century excavators found it beneath the rubble. Tens of thousands of tablets, damaged but legible, containing lunar calculations, eclipse records, mere astronomical procedures that had survived the fall of the empire that had collected them, the rise and fall of the empires that followed, and the long silence of the intervening millennia. The clay was stronger than the city. It was stronger than the empire. It was stronger, ultimately, than the civilization that had pressed it. What the Babylonian and Assyrian record reveals, taken as a whole, is a pattern that the individual empires within it could not have seen from inside their own political horizons. Each successive power that inherited Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, and later Persia, made the same institutional decision. It preserved the lunar knowledge. It maintained the scribal tradition that carried it. It continued the observational program that generated new data to add to the accumulated record, not out of sentiment, or out of recognition that the system worked, that the lunar calendar, the eclipse predictions, the mathematical procedures for tracking the moon's variable behaviour were producing accurate results that no rival system could match. Empires came and went. The observation program continued, which raises a question that the Imperial Archive, for all its scope, leaves suspended. The lunar knowledge that passed from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria survived the collapse of every political structure that had housed it. It outlasted languages, dynasties, and cities. It persisted through catastrophes that erased almost everything else the ancient world had built. But why? What was it about this particular body of knowledge, lunar cycles, eclipse intervals, mathematical models of the moon's orbital behaviour, that made every empire that encountered it decide independently and consistently that it was worth preserving above almost everything else? The answer did not become fully visible until the 19th century AD, when archaeologists finally read what the clay had been holding for 2,500 years. In the mid-19th century, European scholars began pulling clay tablets out the ground in what is now Iraq, and discovered that they could not read them. That gap between holding ancient knowledge in your hands and being unable to access it lasted decades. And what filled that gap slowly, through the painstaking work of decipherment that consumed careers and entire institutional programs, was something that nobody had fully anticipated. The tablets were not what scholars expected to find. They had expected religious mythology. They had expected royal propaganda. They had expected the kind of ancient writing that confirmed what they already believed about the ancient world, a world of superstition and symbol, impressive in its ambition but limited in its precision. What the tablets actually contained forced a quiet, thorough revision of that assumption, and the revision is still ongoing. The excavations that brought Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets to European attention began in earnest in the 1840s, when Austin Henry Layard commenced systematic work at Nineveh and at Nimrud, the site of the ancient Assyrian city of Kalhu. What Layard's excavations uncovered at Nineveh, in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace, was the archive that Assyrian imperial agents had assembled across a century of deliberate collection. Tens of thousands of tablet fragments, fired by the conflagration that had destroyed the city in 612 BC, and preserved by that same destruction for 25 subsequent centuries, emerged from the rubble in a condition that ranged from perfect legibility to fragmentary incompleteness. The tablets were transported to the British Museum in London, where they joined collections arriving from other Mesopotamian sites excavated in the same period. By the 1860s, enough tablets had been collected, catalogued, and partially studied that scholars began to grasp the institutional scope of what they were looking at, although the archive was not a library in the sense that later civilizations would understand. It was a systematic knowledge repository, organised by category, cross-referenced, and maintained with a documentary discipline that suggested the institution behind it had understood with full clarity what it was building. The decipherment of cuneiform proceeded in parallel with the excavations, through a sequence of scholarly breakthroughs that built incrementally on each other across several decades. The Persian royal inscriptions at Behistun, carved into a cliff face in 3 languages, including Old Persian in a cuneiform script, provided the initial key. Henry Rawlinson's work on the Behistun inscription in the 1830s and 40s established the phonetic values of a significant portion of the cuneiform sign inventory, creating a foundation that later scholars extended to Babylonian and then to Sumerian. By the 1870s, enough of the script had been decoded that astronomical tablets from the Nineveh collection could be read in substantive detail. What those tablets said stopped the scholars who read them. George Smith, an Assyriologist working at the British Museum in the 1870s, is most remembered for his identification of a flood narrative in the Gilgamesh tablets, a discovery that caused considerable public sensation when announced in 1872. But the astronomical tablets being studied in the same institution during the same period produced a reaction among scholars that was quieter, more technical, and in certain respects more consequential. The lunar calculation tablets from Nineveh contain numerical procedures of a mathematical sophistication that scholars had not attributed to any ancient civilization outside of classical Greece. They contain methods for computing the moon's variable orbital speed. They contained eclipse prediction procedures based on the Saros cycle. They contained systematic tables for calculating lunar positions across extended time periods, not observed positions but computed ones, generated by mathematical algorithms applied to baseline values derived from centuries of prior observation. The procedures worked, not approximately, not impressively for their age. They worked in the same functional sense that a modern calculation works, producing results that matched the actual behaviour of the moon with an accuracy that the scholars reading them had not expected to encounter in any source outside the European scientific tradition. Here is where the decipherment produced its most disorienting result. Astronomers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began checking the eclipse predictions embedded in Babylonian tablets against independently computed eclipse chronologies, using the known mathematics of celestial mechanics to calculate, backwards through time, exactly when and where solar and lunar eclipses had been visible from specific locations on Earth's surface. The Babylonian predictions matched. Not all of them perfectly. The ancient calculations accumulate small errors over very long periods, for reasons that modern astronomers understand in terms of the gradual slowing of Earth's rotation. But within the time periods the tablets cover, and accounting for that systematic drift, the eclipse records are accurate. Events predicted in cuneiform, on clay tablets pressed in ancient Babylon, correspond to eclipses that modern orbital mechanics independently confirms occurred on those dates, visible from those locations in those approximate forms. The moon had not changed. The numbers the ancient scholars recorded were the moon's actual numbers, and the clay had held them, without corruption, across 25 centuries of burial, excavation, transport, and institutional handling, long enough for a civilization that had developed entirely independent mathematical tools to check the ancient work and find it sound. The scholarly implications took time to fully absorb. Otto Neugebauer, the historian of ancient mathematics whose mid-20th century analysis of Babylonian astronomical tablets remains foundational, described the mathematical procedures he found in those texts as representing a level of arithmetical astronomy that Europe did not independently develop until the late medieval period. The gap he was describing was not a few generations, it was more than 1,000 years. Procedures that Babylonian scholars were applying routinely in the last centuries BC, embedded in tablets copied from earlier originals, themselves drawing on observational traditions reaching back into the Sumerian period, had no equivalent in the Western astronomical tradition until well into the first millennium AD. That timeline does not suggest a primitive precursor to real science. It describes a fully developed scientific tradition that was lost, buried, and then recovered, not through continuous transmission, but through archaeology. The recovery is still incomplete. Thousands of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamian sites remain unstudied in museum collections around the world. The British Museum alone holds more tablets than its curatorial staff can process at current research rates. Collections in Berlin, Paris, Philadelphia, Baghdad, and Istanbul contain material that has been catalogued but not fully analysed. Some of those unstudied tablets are astronomical, and some of them contain lunar data from periods and sites not yet represented in the published scholarly record. The picture of ancient Mesopotamian astronomy that current scholarship presents is based on a fraction of the surviving evidence, which means the precision already documented, the eclipse predictions, the orbital calculations, the mathematical procedures confirmed by modern astronomy, represents a lower bound. The full extent of what the ancient scholars knew is not yet visible. It is still emerging tablet by tablet from collections assembled in the 19th century and not yet fully read. The clay held the numbers for 25 centuries. It is still holding some of them, and that returns everything to the question that the tablets, the excavations, and the modern verifications together make unavoidable. If the moon never forgot the numbers that ancient Mesopotamian scholars pressed into clay, if those calculations survive, accurate and verifiable, across a gap of millennia, then what exactly did the ancient world leave behind? Not myth, not metaphor, something more precise than either. The final answer is not in the archaeological record alone. It is in what the entire accumulated tradition, from the first grain lists of Uruk to the fired tablets of Nineveh to the museum collections still being studied today, reveals about what ancient Mesopotamian scholars were actually doing, and why. The title of this account makes a promise. It is time to keep it, carefully and without evasion. What the Anunnaki left on the moon is not what the title implies in the way most listeners will have initially understood it. There are no structures on the lunar surface attributable to ancient Mesopotamian civilization. No machines. No hidden cities on the far side. No physical artifacts waiting in the regolith for a future excavation team to uncover and identify. The archaeological and astronomical record, examined honestly and in full, does not support those conclusions, but it does support something else. Something that, once stated plainly, carries a weight that speculation about lunar structures does not, because it is real, it is documented, and it has been independently verified by the most precise scientific tools the modern world has developed for the purpose. What the Anunnaki left on the moon was a record of it, not on its surface, in clay, in archives. Is in a mathematical tradition so precisely calibrated to the moon's actual behaviour that modern astronomy, checking ancient Babylonian calculations against independently computed orbital mechanics, finds them accurate. That is the inheritance, not technology, not physical presence. Observation, sustained, institutionally maintained, mathematically refined, and preserved across a span of time that makes the entire history of modern science look brief by comparison. The observation program that produced the surviving cuneiform lunar record ran continuously, across multiple empires and several language transitions, for more than 1,500 years. 1,500 years of watching the same object, pressing the results into clay, and building each generation's calculations on the accumulated baseline of every generation before it. Now, the specific achievements that record contains have been laid out across the preceding chapters, but they deserve to be gathered here in their final form, because seen together, their cumulative weight is different from their individual impressions. Babylonian lunar tables computed the moon's variable orbital speed with sufficient accuracy to generate position predictions that modern software confirms. Eclipse predictions embedded in cuneiform tablets correspond to eclipses that modern orbital mechanics independently verifies occurred on those dates, visible from those locations. The Saros cycle, 223 lunations, 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours, was identified, confirmed, and applied predictively by scholars working more than 2,000 years before European astronomy independently derived the same interval. The mathematical procedures used to generate those predictions were, as 20th century historians of science established, operating at a level of arithmetical sophistication that the Western tradition did not independently reach until more than 1,000 years after Babylon had already encoded them in clay. These are not contested claims. They are the findings of mainstream scholarship, verified by independent disciplines, and available in the published academic record for anyone who looks. Here is where the full account arrives at something that no individual chapter could carry alone. The Anunnaki, as authentic Sumerian theology understood them, were administrators of divine order, a cosmic assembly whose authority was inseparable from documentation, whose decisions were recorded on tablets of destiny, and whose governance of the universe operated through written decree rather than arbitrary force. That theological framework did not exist alongside the astronomical tradition. It was the astronomical tradition translated into the language that Mesopotamian civilization used to describe how order worked. When Sumerian scribes described the moon as Nana's domain, when they framed lunar phases as divine administration, eclipse predictions as cosmic judgments, and the tablet of destinies as the document through which universal order was maintained, they were not decorating their science with mythology. They were describing, in the only conceptual language available to them, a genuine institutional achievement, a long-running observational program whose outputs were accurate enough to govern calendars, predict eclipses, and generate mathematical models of celestial behavior that have survived verification by modern science. The gods and the numbers were the same thing, expressed in two different registers of the same civilization. The moon did not preserve myth. Clay preserved observation. The distinction matters, not because myth is unimportant, but because the achievement being described here is larger than myth requires it to be. A civilization that produced accurate eclipse predictions across 1,500 years of continuous institutional effort did not need supernatural assistance to explain its results. It needed time, discipline, archival continuity, and a scribal tradition sophisticated enough to carry accumulated knowledge across the deaths of languages, the falls of empires, and the long silences between one political order and the next. All of those conditions were met. The tablets are the proof that they were met. And those tablets, fired accidentally by the destruction of Nineveh, excavated by 19th century archaeologists, transported to museum collections across Europe, partially studied, partially catalogued and still partially unread, represent a fraction of what the ancient observation program produced. The unread portion is the detail that lingers. Thousands of cuneiform tablets in institutional collections around the world have not yet been fully analysed. Some of them are astronomical. Some of them contain lunar data from periods and sites not yet represented in the published scholarly record. The picture that current scholarship presents of ancient Mesopotamian lunar knowledge is built on incomplete evidence, which means the precision already documented is a lower bound. The moon that ancient Mesopotamian scholars watched for 1,500 years may have given up more of its secrets to their clay than modern scholarship has yet recovered. The moon became humanity's first long-term archive because ancient Mesopotamian scholars chose to watch it longer than almost anyone else. They watched it from reed marsh settlements before cities existed. They watched it from ziggurat summits built to bring the horizon closer. They watched it through the administrative machinery of empires that rose and fell around them without interrupting the observation. They pressed what they saw into clay, organised it into archives, taught it in scribal schools, and passed it forward across a span of time so long that the tradition outlasted the civilization that had built it. What they left behind is still being read. Some of it has not been read yet. And if clay could preserve the sky for 4,000 years, if a material as simple as dried mud could carry mathematical knowledge across the collapse of languages, empires, and civilizations intact, enough for modern software to verify it, what other quiet knowledge still waits unread beneath the soil?